Hello everyone, welcome to tonight's edition of Live on Air, and we're discussing a parable from the Gospel of Luke, the parable of the lost sheep, and how that interacts with maths and science education today. And sitting next to me I've got Rosheen Gray, who's an expert teacher from very long standing. So let's cut to the chase, Rosheen. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, good evening, everyone. Yes, as David says, I have been a math teacher in New Zealand for about 30 years now. Prior to that, before we immigrated to New Zealand, I was teaching science and biology in South Africa, and also had a time when I was working in a medical research laboratory, which was absolutely wonderful. So that's my background in science teaching and maths teaching.
So really you're steeped in maths, and there was a most interesting program on national radio this morning. Professor of communication or sociology, something like that in New York, was saying that in his opinion most of the mathematics that's taught at high school is useless, and that children, as they become young adults and then eventually leave school, that never use all of the stuff we teach them. So we'll be exploring that in our own kind of way as tonight progresses. But I'm going to bring up the screen share and just to show you what our question set is this evening. We're going to start with an explanation of the parable of the Good Shepherd, Luke 15. Actually, that should be 1 to 7. And then I'll explore a little about what's interesting and enjoyable about teaching parables. And a little later on, we'll look at just 3 outstanding Christian claims that I personally would want all students of every religion or no religion to know for the rest of their lives, because I think they're important. As far as Rosheen is going in this dialogue, she's going to be coming at the teaching of science and maths and what are the joys involved in that, and then what are the pitfalls or the aspects that take the shine off the vocation today. And in general terms, she's going to identify just 3 outstanding science or maths ideas that she'd want all students to know about, irrespective of their religion, for the rest of their lives. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the parable of the Good Shepherd. It comes from Luke chapter 15. And Rosheen and I together are going to read tonight's parable. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them."
Then Jesus told them this parable. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep."
I tell you, in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who don't need to repent. So that's the parable of the Good Shepherd, and what a fascinating parable it is.
Will you explain that one to us, please, David?
Well, when we read that parable, it was good to have 2 voices reading, because it highlighted the fact that there's a kind of an introduction to the parable. It gives it a setting, if you like. It's Jesus is somehow going to teach the scribes and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and so you've got that setting for it. Then you've got the parable, and then somehow the last verse relates back to the original setting. So this is what a century or more ago the scholars used to call the situation in life, and what they were getting at was that Luke was trying to give the parable a context. He was trying to put it into a life setting, and the life setting happened to be dialogue and interaction with people who became his enemies, effectively. So that's the explanation of the parable. And Why I'm quite, I suppose, enchanted by these parables, particularly the parables in Luke, is that you often see really quite enlightened ideas coming out that resonate down the centuries. It's not that Jesus just told this in a particular setting that Luke's given us, but you could actually apply that parable into numerous kinds of settings. So the shepherd goes out in search of the lost sheep, and he leaves the 99 sheep that are safe and secure, and he sets out on his own adventure to bring back the lost sheep. Now, how you apply that, what messages you want to read into it, and what messages you want to draw out of it, become to me quite an exciting thing, particularly when the parables multiply up into larger and larger stories. But it does seem to me that this is a parable about the joy of the discovery of something that is not in the mainstream. So there we go. That's why I enjoy parables.
Can I ask a question? May I ask a question?
Go for it, Stuart.
Well, you're obviously excited about your parable, and that's understandable. You're a preacher. You're used to this kind of thing. Could I address my question to Rosheen? How do you apply that to your teaching of maths and science?
My joy of teaching of maths and science?
Yes.
Well, I suppose my joy of teaching of maths and science, maths really in the last 30 years, just comes from that general love of learning. And I suppose with mathematics, it's trying to teach a subject that is very different to any other subject that the students are coming across in their curricula. It's a discipline on its own. It's got its own language. It's got its own rigor. And I suppose too, for me, the challenge is to demystify a subject that so many students seem to find so difficult, or seem to think is so difficult, and to try and help them through that. I enjoy talking about those that have gone before. I enjoy talking about those mathematicians who have blazed that trail ahead, standing on the shoulders, as Isaac Newton, or maybe it was someone else, has said before him. And I suppose it just gives me a chance to indulge in the things that interest me and that I find so enjoyable, and to put a subject as abstract as mathematics into the real life world, and to trying to help the students make sense of mathematics in a real life world.
This morning on national radio, as I mentioned, there was this professor in New York who was saying, well, most of the high school students exit from high school, even if they go on into university and do some further mathematics. Most of the time, in his opinion, or almost all of the time in his opinion, they never use the mathematics that they've been taught. Well, he knows that this is a kind of a controversial thing to say. He actually said there are about 200,000 registered high school mathematics teachers in the United States, and that part of their vocation, if you like, was trying to persuade other people that you should keep learning mathematics. So it was a very articulate, well-reasoned kind of, but actually, Rosheen, I think it's completely irrelevant. I would hazard the guess that 80 to 90% of everything that's taught in school isn't directly used once you leave school. Any comment on that?
Yeah, and I think too, I've heard that sort of argument as well. I think about the fact that when they get to tertiary institutions, that the mathematics has to be retaught. I'm not sure why. Is it a different sort of mathematics that they're wanting or needing? But I still think that whole discipline of the subject can't be discounted. Just the whole need to have that discipline. And of course, there's the language of mathematics as well. I think that's quite an important way of dealing with it. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, if I went back into the history of mathematics and I looked at the way that the ancient Greek society did mathematics, they did it basically entirely in geometry. They didn't use algebra, and they certainly didn't have a nice easy number base like we do. And then also the ancient Sumerians and then the Babylonians, they devised really quite complex ways of dealing with numeracy. And my favorite illustration is that what I wear on my wrist is actually the direct result of ancient Babylonian mathematics, and a number base of 60. And that's because lots of things can divide into 60. And so the joy for me in terms of mathematics, Rosheen, was always that it wasn't so much that you had to be able to solve a quadratic equation or some matrices or whatever. It was the fact that it taught you to think in a particular kind of way. It taught you to think either with abstract geometric pictures or abstract algebraic pictures.
And I think this is why so many people find it difficult. They find the abstract nature of the subject, particularly with regard to algebra. I think they find that quite hard to deal with.
Right.
And it comes back to basic numeracy in the first level. I think the numeracy is a big issue. If they numerate, and then the move to algebra becomes a little bit easier. So yeah.
Well, the guy from New York this morning, he was very much in favour of numeracy because he did understand that if you could use fractions, you could convey an awful lot of ideas with just putting a couple of fractions up and then maybe turning it into a pie chart, etc. But I think he sort of really wanted to stop at a particular point that doesn't take you into the joy of discovery. Now, as a teacher, do you find many children, pupils, students, whatever, get that joy out of?
Definitely. I think the ones that don't find it a chore, the ones that can get into the abstract nature of the subject, the ones that are disciplined about what they do, and of course the ones that can think conceptually, they certainly do. That real kick that they get when they are confronted with quite a difficult problem, and when they get it out in the end, it's quite a lot of joy in doing that.
Right. What about the pitfalls associated with teaching of mathematics?
Of teaching of mathematics, or teaching in general? Teaching of mathematics. I think the general pitfalls in teaching are really outside the classroom. Once you're in that classroom, the stage is yours, really, and you can indulge. And I can be quite, I can be quite selfish there and indulge in my own passion and try and instill some of that, I suppose, enthusiasm into students. So most of it would be outside. It's the paperwork, really, I suppose. And with every job, with every vocation comes the paperwork. And the paperwork must be done, I'm afraid. The paperwork has to be done as well.
There's just, I think, though, a tremendous amount of paperwork that's now generated that wouldn't have been there 30 years ago.
Very much so. I think we've seen huge changes. We've seen huge changes in New Zealand, the way students are assessed in New Zealand. And I teach at a school where we offer an international diploma as well, which has its way of assessing. Certainly, I have my own ideas about why this is all happening. It does. It does put the load, the paperwork, the administrivia too is becoming larger, I feel, for teachers.
Yeah, I suspect that there's going to be yet another disenchantment with the new teachers coming on, and particularly I suspect that IT has made some significant disruptions to the classroom.
In which way?
in all kinds of ways, but I'm thinking quite specifically that IT would allow a class to move in a quite different direction. So you've got, you know, perhaps multiple things happening, whereas it tended to be more focused at one stage.
Sorry, I misheard you, David. Yes, certainly technology has... I want to go back to the classroom as a student. When I see what some of my colleagues are doing in other subject areas, it's really quite exciting. Technology has changed the way we teach. There is no doubt about it. And it is such a dynamic environment now. Technology doesn't stand still for a moment. So our incorporation of that technology in the classroom doesn't stand still. That's another thing that's quite demanding for the profession, to keep up with that technology.
Right.
Yes.
I'll just take a very short break here, Rosheen and Stuart. Max has asked, is there any possibility of eliminating the echo? Max, could you just make a comment and let us know, is that echo still working, or which end was it coming from, our end or Stuart's end? Because, as you know, I've got an increasing difficulty with various audio streams at present, so I'd be very grateful if you could just feed that back in. Okay, Stuart, is there anything that you want to add, or a question that you would like to ask either Rosheen or myself in this area of either science or parables? We've talked about the joys and a little of the pitfalls.
I'd like to make an observation about teaching in generally. You were discussing your enjoyment about, or otherwise, about teaching maths and science. And the thing that stands out that's common to you both, working from parables on the one hand and from maths and science on the other, is that you're both telling stories with enthusiasm. The second thing is that telling of stories has a challenge of discovering for the individual. And I'd like to go from that comment then to your next question, David, which was, do you find the same enthusiasm and joy in the students? And I'm going to suggest...
Okay, Stuart, I've just had a comment from Max that the echo is really bad at your end, so could I pick up the question and we'll deal with it and then come back to you a little bit later. So possibly this question of our common enthusiasm, well, I had a background in teaching mathematics also, but I suspect that enthusiasm runs in every field, and it's not just enthusiasm if you're a teacher. I think enthusiasm is about enthusiasm for learning as opposed to enthusiasm for the subject. So the best teachers are, in my opinion, always the best learners. Learning and teaching run hand in hand. And I pick up this in every field. That doesn't mean formal education, but in businesses. If you look at, say, many of the small business owners who have to directly teach people how to do their job or their skill set within a particular working environment, they will be very enthusiastic to make sure that that person does it. And of course, if the employee then returns that with a degree of learning about it, the whole has become greater than the mere act of instruction. Any comment about that, Rosheen?
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's not specific to the profession or the learning profession. Definitely not. But coming back to the pitfalls, nothing beats being in a classroom with young people and having that privilege and that absolute privilege of being with young people when they're wanting to learn.
I remember way back in my dim, distant past memories as a teacher, there was one particular class where they all went on to become a very high-level academics and goodness knows doctors and mathematicians, etc. But in terms of my own experience at school, there was another chap and myself who, in the sixth form, we were the top two in physics. And the physics teacher of the time, he was a quite marvellous chap. He had a lot of psychological insights into his pupils. And he said to my father at a parent-teacher interview, he said, "Oh, well, the other guy, I won't name him, the other guy, let's call him Ralph, just for example's sake. Ralph is natural. He doesn't have to work at it. But your son, he has to work at it." And actually, I stopped working at it in terms of physics. It turned out to be a complete disaster. But then the pitfalls of teaching religion are exactly the same as the pitfalls of teaching science or mathematics. There's a vast number of people that simply don't want to learn it. They will go through the motions of learning, but they're not enthusiastic to learn in that particular way. Now, I can't blame them. I'm not enthusiastic to learn, just for example's sake, accounting. Though Stuart would probably, if he had the audio feed going, he would give the example of the fact that one of the most significant things in the history of the world was when the double entry bookkeeping system was introduced. And I mean, that literally changed everything. It's not just an educative thing, it's got that practical application out into real life. Rosheen, do you see students exiting from school and being able to take the enthusiasm for a subject like mathematics and apply the enthusiasm for learning generally? Do you see that happening?
I think if a student is an enthusiastic learner, generally, they will take that enthusiasm with them. I think, you mentioned this, the learners that perhaps are not quite as involved or want to be quite as involved or reticent to learn. They're not going to be quite as enthusiastic. But those enthusiastic students who show that academic bent, I think they just love learning. I teach some of those wonderfully gifted students, and I'm in awe of them. I think wonderful future ahead of them. Yes, I do think they take it with them.
And in a way, that actually takes us to the heart of why there should be a dialogue, in my opinion, between science and mathematics and the education involved in that, with the aspects of faith and religion. Now, just because I happen and Rosheen happens to be in the Christian faith, doesn't mean that dialogue shouldn't also be happening across faiths. And I mean, in today's world, many people are unaware, for example, of how much influence Islam had on the development of science and mathematics, and the kind of dialogue between the two aspects, if you like, the religious aspect and the scientific aspect, was very natural for century upon century in the world of Islam. Many people in our society are unaware that the foundation of what we would call algebraic mathematics is laid in India.
Is it India, or I know the fellow's name is Al-Jabra.
Oh, yeah, Al-Jabra is the Islamic development. Yeah. But no, prior to that, centuries prior to that, the invention of the kind of number base that we use is springing out of, India, but there's also a parallel over in China. So in this sense, and Stuart, I would like to ask you, despite the bad audio, to make a comment on this. It's not just enthusiasm for the subject, but subjects arise universally in cultures, in religions, in how we educate the young. Certain ideas are kind of universal. And in one way, music, though it takes very different forms in China, India, and the West, music is a universal language. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. Yes is the obvious answer. No, if it's in calling it a language, you give it the qualities of ordinary language in literature. There's a danger in making comparisons there.
Yeah, okay, could you just say in one sentence, because I didn't quite get the audio there, could you repeat what you said in your last sentence? Thanks, Stuart.
Well, to your question, my answer was, is music a language? It is in its universality, but in its uniqueness, it's music. It's not like a written language.
Okay, thank you. Got that. Music is not like a written language, but there is a universal kind of quality about music. People world over relate culturally to their own music making. And Rosheen, would you say that that's true of mathematics?
I think mathematics has got less of a cultural aspect to it, in the way mathematics plays out in life today. For example, perhaps a civil engineer, no matter where in the world they might be using the same mathematics in the same way, without a cultural bent to it. I don't know if I'm quite interpreting your question.
Oh, I think you're well and truly on the. I believe that mathematics is a universal language that can be developed to be independent of culture. Whereas music is a universal language that gets embedded and arises up from different cultures. So you have different, I can see Stuart nodding at that point.
Yeah.
So in that sense, music and mathematics do certain things differently, but in another sense, they're both universal. And in my opinion, and I'd very briefly like Rosheen to comment on this, mathematics has a power that transcends any other power, whether it be spoken language, written language. And the power is that it describes nature. It's called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Mathematics is not to be identified with nature, but you can't describe nature without mathematics. Any comments on that, Rosheen?
Yes, I would agree. I think the thing, going back to the music idea again, though, is the lack of emotion as such within mathematics, within the using of mathematics, the describing using mathematics. Whereas in music, you've got that emotion in the language that comes through.
My observation would be that when anyone makes a certain kind of mathematical proof for themselves,
I think that's
that's the
exciting.
eureka moment.
For sure, that's very exciting. That's very emotional. One only has to go back to Andrew Wiles and his proving Fermat's last theorem, and that was very exciting.
Because he didn't actually get it the first time, he said, "I've got it. I've solved the impossible."
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And yes, imagine standing up in a hall of mathematicians and then having your error of your ways pointed out. But fortunately, he managed to correct it. And I don't think it took him too long, just a couple of weeks, I think. Yeah. No, there is that excitement. But I mean, in the actual communication, like a piece of music, I suppose music is interpreted too, but in a different way. But I don't think mathematics has that same emotion in its communication.
Well, we're really at the heart of what are the three things that we both think should be communicated, because we're both saying that we believe mathematics has a kind of a universality about it, and it can generate intense emotion, even more intense than music making, I suspect. But if I ask you, Rosheen, if you had three things, outstanding things that you wanted any student, anywhere, any culture, any religion, what would they be from science and mathematics? Hard question.
Yes, that is an extremely hard question. I think due to the nature of science and maths, and they are quite different in their own ways too, but due to the nature of the subjects, I would hope that any student going into the world would be critical of what they hear and are exposed to. That's critical and reflective and open-minded, but without being cynical. I think it's I think there's often just a fine edge there between being critical and being cynical about, especially in science. You notice science and discoveries in science taking place so often, and initially we might want to discount. Our first feeling might be to discount it, but to just sit back and listen and be open-minded about what is going on.
I mean, science is you're quite right. Science and mathematics are very distinct areas, and they're very distinctive in terms of how you teach them. But they do have that one factor in common, that anything that purports to be science, in the end, will yield up mathematical secrets. You can't proceed in science without somehow mathematizing the experience.
Yes, that's true.
So biologists will use a lot of statistical data.
Yes, that's true.
But mathematics can't tell you how life begins. And actually, science has a lot of difficulty explaining the origins of life. But what you were saying there, Rosheen, the essence of it is open-mindedness, particularly in science. Yeah.
Because all of those ideas that have become big ideas had started with a moment when someone has had a hunch about something, and that hunch becomes a hypothesis, and then you go through that whole scientific method, and eventually you get to that place where that is proven or otherwise, or thrown out.
Yeah, that, in fact, I'm really glad Rosheen mentioned that, because the essence of the scientific method has never been described better than by Sir Karl Popper, the logic of scientific discovery. And that is that anything that is scientific is capable of being falsified. You can produce better science, better explanation. So it's always a self-correcting system, which in practical terms equates to open-mindedness. But of course, then if we try and apply that into the real world, and this is where our New York professor, I think, is really quite crazy in his ideas. For 30 years, I've been following the dietary advice, and I've been getting bigger and bigger and bigger about stacking up on carbohydrates instead of concentrated proteins. And it now turns out that I was at the doctors very recently, and the practice nurse was saying, oh yes, look, it's the same for me. I've been giving patients this advice for 30 years. Now I've got to say a little bit of butter won't harm you the same way. So science, by being capable of being falsified, also produces the skepticism that you were talking about. And this doesn't happen in mathematics, and I suspect it doesn't happen in music either. But were there any other things that you wanted to get across to kids that might be, really important?
Well, I think it's always trying to, this is the teacher coming out, trying to link conceptually, because it's all about concepts, really. You can't teach a subject like mathematics by rote learning, no matter what people might do. You cannot do it. It just won't stick. So it's that conceptual, that deep conceptual understanding, and linking it to hopefully concepts that are already embedded or in the schema, or whatever the research term is for it. But to make those meaningful links means that you're going to make meaning of the things that you're trying to study.
Okay, so it's making links, it's deriving meaning, and it's being open-minded in the process. Now, I did a bit of thinking. I didn't have to think too hard about the 3 things that I thought I would like every student worldwide to know about Christianity. Whether they follow it or not, it's irrelevant. But I think these are the things that sum it up. The first is very strongly an Old Testament concept, and no matter what you conceive God to be, whether you're Hindu, Buddhist, even if you're an atheist and don't believe in God, at least the principle behind this stands, and that is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then you've got Jesus' New Testament application of that, though it's there in the Old Testament as well, but he makes it very clear. And you should love your neighbour as yourself. Now, those 2, I think, are the bedrock of Christian belief. Whether people choose to follow that is entirely over to them. I couldn't really care less whether they do or they don't. But if I had to then add in a third, well, just before I add in a third, John Wesley, when asked at the end of his very long, productive Christian life, what is a Methodist? He said, a Methodist is someone who follows the old principles and those 2 things. And then I would add a third thing, and that is I would like people to become involved with the stories that are called the parables. Now, they can be read, as I said, given a setting. Oh, this is all about sin and sinners and heaven rejoicing, etc. But if you looked just back at those italicized words, let me bring the screen share up again. The parable of the lost sheep is about setting out on an adventure to find something that appears lost. And when it's found, it's a matter of rejoicing. And he calls his friends and neighbours together and he says, rejoice with me. I found what I was looking for. To me, that is, leave aside the life setting, which appears, if this parable has been embedded in there, it's actually far more universal than talking about sin, sinners, and repentance. It's actually a parable of quite overwhelming joy about finding that which appeared to be lost and having no compunction about leaving the crowd to go out and make that discovery. Well, you know, what is it that I've lost? This, to me, seems to be at the heart of mathematical discovery, scientific discovery, musical discovery, and religious or spiritual discovery. It's rejoicing over finding something new. So that, to me, is the only way I see of there being a practical reconciliation of scientific method with religious experience. Just as the scientist and the mathematician rejoice over the discovery of a new formula or a new scientific insight, so the religious person rejoices over the discovery of that which gives meaning and value to their life. Stuart, you've been very silent and enforced silence because of your audio problems. Do you agree?
Yes. With qualifications.
Okay. But fortunately, because your audio stream is so bad, we're not going to listen to the qualifications. We'll just take it as read. There are some qualifications in there. Rosheen, would you like to have the final word? Because we're coming very close. We've gone just a minute beyond our appointed hour.
No, I've just really enjoyed this discussion. There always is that argument about the scientific method in religion, and there will always continue to be. And it's always a good and robust discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming on here tonight. And the three of us will say good night, and we'll see you again next week when we've got John Evans, Reverend Dr. John Evans from the Uniting Church in Australia, and the Reverend Ian Faulkner, and it's one of our political discussions. And next week we'll be discussing Brexit and the lamentable state of politics over in Oz, and all kinds of things like that. So hope to see you again later on. Thanks for watching.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.